know that it was coming up today, and all we can see it is that it will go to the Board of Internal Economy for investigation and probably action if necessary.
Yesterday, of course, we heard about the incredible allegations against two Liberal MPs now suspended, and also their re-election bids suspended by the leader of the third party, Justin Trudeau. Hello, everyone. I'm Adrienne Batra. Thanks very much for staying with us here at Sun News. You just saw Nicole Turmel from the NDP last night on the arena with Michael Corrin. For more on what could happen with these MPs, what their recourse is, I'm joined by two lawyers, which is very helpful to me because I don't want to get sued, Ed Prucci and Howard Levitt. Nice to see both of you. Thank you very much for being here.
I'm not sure we're going to save you from being sued. Though.
Well,
yeah,
I hope not.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's, let's sort of start with the politics of this. So we've got two Liberal MPs with allegations from two NDP MPs. It's widely reported that they are two women NDP MPs. But here's what we know, Howard. They are, according to Justin Trudeau's words, serious personal misconduct. And then we've now, of course, learned that at least one of the complaints may involve so-called alleged sexual harassment. These two MPs have both come up with statements. One in particular said, hey, the leader didn't even tell me why I'm being suspended. I know that there are different rules when it comes to members of parliament and privilege and things like that. But at is their recourse at this point? Does this process just go through the normal channels as it would?
Well, what's happened is really quite scandalous. I mean, it's really showed to me, in any event, that the leader of the third party really is his mother's son. You don't say that we presume that the complainants are telling the truth. You don't presume anything, because that means you presume that the accused are guilty with any sort of hearing. Now, I understand in these politically correct times, Justin might want to say that, but it's simply at variance with the Human Rights Code, which puts the onus on the complainant, actually, on a balance of probabilities, a narrow measure, but still the balance of probabilities. And then what you don't do in any workplace investigation is you don't out the accused before especially when they're professing their innocence.
Absolutely.
I mean, he announced who they were. He said they had personal misconduct. Those were the allegations, and we presume the innocence and the accuracy of the allegations of the accused without any kind of investigation. It's really outrageous. If that occurred in a Canadian workplace, and ultimately they were found not to be guilty as charged in a civil sense, in a workplace harassment sense, the punitive damage award against Trudeau in that case, or against a private employer, would be massive.
So would they have
and it would be liable too.
Well, so could they actually potentially, if the process is going to be investigated by the Speaker of the House, which is in of itself a bit unusual, but that's the process in which we find ourselves in. Can then these two MPs, their name of course, Massimo Pichetti and Scott Andrews, can they then sue the leader?
Well,
could they do that?
I'm not familiar with parliamentary privilege and where he said it and whether it was in a privileged context. I haven't seen the exact script of his words.
He did say it in the House, so it wouldn't be privileged.
In the House?
He did not say it in the House.
No. Let's also keep in mind that it's not said in the House, but this is a scenario in which we're all talking about process. There is no process, and that's part of the thing that's so confusing about this, right? This hasn't happened before, which perhaps is the most surprising element of it, but this is the first time we've seen MPs accused of this kind of behavior, and the party whips, both the Liberal and NDP whip who first brought this forward, gave every indication that they didn't even know how to proceed with this. So it was referred to the Speaker because, just as a catch-all, the Speaker is responsible for the conduct of the people in the House. But I don't know that the Speaker, I mean, right now I'm sure he's scrambling and his office is scrambling to try to put together a process, but there isn't a process in place right now. So, you know, what's going to happen next, who's going to be responsible for whom, and what presumptions were made are all going to come into play, but much later down the line, I think.
Does timeline play anything into this? Because in one instance we've learned that one complainant was one last year and another was perhaps 3 to 6 months ago. Does any of that matter when it comes to this?
It only matters if the leader knew about it and did nothing.
Okay.
But if it only came to the attention of, in that case, Trudeau, now, then it doesn't matter that it occurred 6 months ago.
Does it surprise you, though, that one woman in particular, one of the NDP MPs, didn't go to her own leader? She went directly to Trudeau, according to the information that we've got.
Yeah, I don't know if that surprises me necessarily. I mean, it depends on the personality of the individual and what the behavior is involved. She may have felt, I don't need to go to my teacher, to my leader. This sounds very sort of schoolyard. I'll go right to the person who's purportedly the leader and who will discipline the person who I think I have a problem with, and I'll go right to Trudeau. I don't need to go through these sort of back channels. I mean, other people may have felt it's not appropriate to jump the gun. They should vet it it with the party, speak to Mulcair, for example, if it's an NDP issue. The route upon which that the complaint is made, I don't think matters so much. What matters is what are we going to do now that the complaint is made? How are you going to ensure that complainants feel willing to come forward and are properly heard, while at the same time, as Howard says, protecting those people who have not yet been found guilty of anything, whether that's a criminal case or whether that's simply a harassment issue within the workplace. Because as we know, the allegation itself is toxic. I mean, how people recover from that as politicians, I don't know.
Well, it's almost impossible, especially if a process is private, and then at the end of the day, they're found to be guilty. They don't return to caucus.
Yeah.
They're already damned. And how fair will the process be, and how fair will it be perceived to be, given Trudeau's initial statements
well,
about these presumptions?
And it is partisan, because Andrew Scheer, as the Speaker, is a member of the government, and is a Conservative. And I'm not sure. I'm not suggesting that he would be unfair or anything like that. I think Scheer's been relatively fair as far as his role as Speaker. But there still is that political element to it.
For sure, it's so awkward to have an NDP complaint about a Liberal accusation being judged by a Conservative Speaker, and all
maybe Elizabeth May should just be the judge and jury.
She's the only one who's appropriate to bet.
But is that who's adjudicating? Is it the Speaker of the House?
They haven't decided that yet. It's in the Speaker's office.
I suspect it'll be internal until there's a formal complaint made to the House as opposed to the leader of one of the parties. Yeah. We don't know if it'll even get to the Speaker.
Well,
and it depends, of course, what Trudeau ends up doing and what ends up happening. If there's a process even put in place that's serious and reasonable and takes the interest of all parties in consideration.
There's all aspects of this, I think, that are rather unusual. Perhaps not the harassment itself. That's relatively common. But as I mentioned to you yesterday, what so often happens, especially in the world of politics, where I've worked for far longer than I'd care to admit, but there is a power differential if you're working for a member of Parliament, like John Ivison in the National Post wrote about, a young woman working for a Liberal MP. She complained she was sexually harassed and nothing was done. But this is an elected official to an elected official. So there is a bit of a difference in that sense. So I know we are in uncharted territory, but this is what Massimo Pichetti said yesterday. He issued a statement, a few hours after the allegations came out. He said, at 9:30 this morning, I was informed by Justin Trudeau that I've been suspended from caucus based on allegations against me, quote, of personal misconduct. I've not been provided with the specific details of the allegations that led to the suspension. And so I just want to go back to this of Trudeau's actions in not giving them, being forthcoming with these two individuals, or
his two MPs. He suspends them, despite their protesting their innocence. Secondly, he announces to the world, to all of Canada, including their electorates, the people who voted for them, their constituents, that he presumes the other side is telling the truth and therefore that they're guilty, and they're already publicly outed.
Yeah.
It's just, it's so both illegal in the context of the presumption of innocence and guilt, and in a human rights context, which this really ultimately is, to the extent there's legal issues involved at all. And it's grossly unfair, as others were talking about, an administrative process.
I can just imagine the phone calls that these two men got from their wives.
The process that Trudeau should be getting.
Right.
The Trudeau should be getting. How are other people going to feel in caucus?
Pichetti has said that he will, of course, continue to sit as an independent member of Parliament and continue to represent his constituents.
He can hardly resign.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So he's not at that point, but I don't, help me with this, Ed.
Well, it's that lack of specificity that as a criminal defense lawyer, I know this isn't criminal yet, although some people have talked about maybe it will become that, but that's the most disturbing element to me, which is, look, an allegation is made, it's got to be taken seriously, there has to be a process, someone has to investigate, but the accused individual, these two Liberal MPs, have every right to know who's saying this, what did they say, when did they say it, because I'm now responsible for determining how I'm going to respond to that. They may choose to make no response and go through the process, whether that's private or otherwise, or they may choose, because it's been made so public by Trudeau in the first place, that they're going to become public themselves and say, I know what this is about, here's my side of the story, and I'm telling it all to you right now. Instead, you've got two people who are largely in the dark, and they don't know what the allegation references, and they don't know how to respond or react to it. That puts them in an impossible position.
There's one thing that is most central to Canadian law: the right to know the case against you and to have a chance to meet it.
That's right.
That's central to all administrative law.
And by virtue of that definition, Howard, by all accounts of what I've read and what I know about this case thus far with the Liberal and NDP MPs, those two men didn't get that.
That's why I say it's scandalous.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. Howard and Ed are going to stay with me. And speaking of scandalous, we're going to move on to the Jian Ghomeshi file and bring you the latest on that. Stay tuned.
Went up behind her. She was leaning over her desk between the corridor of the executive producer's office and her desk.
Yeah.
So contrary, she was leaned over contrary to where she sat.
Yeah.
Okay. And she's bending over, working on some papers, and he came up behind her, grabbed her by the waist, and humped her like 4 or 5 times. Like he drove his pelvis into her buttocks.
Yeah.
Okay. So and a big smile on his face.
The union's saying that they have no record of her complaining about this, and I have evidence to the contrary.
Okay. Well, I witnessed it.
That, of course, is the voice of Roberto Verri, a former chase producer on the show Q, speaking to Jesse Brown, the investigative journalist at Canadaland.com, who's been working with the Toronto Star's Kevin Donovan to reveal so much information on Jian Ghomeshi. With me are Ed Prucci and Howard Levitt to sort of pick apart the latest that we found out in this story. And what we're talking about now, of course, is a memo that was obtained by the Globe and Mail. It's called Q and Work Culture. It was a document that was drafted in 2012, according to the Globe and Mail sources. There's the information there that shows the producers, the chasers, everybody working on the show Q was living in this so-called culture of fear. One thing that jumped out at me, well, there's a number of things that jump out at me. One in particular had to do with the show's host, and that they felt that they would be punished for, saying anything about what was going on. They were overworked, overstressed, and all of these things. One thing in particular, staff members are often held at the whim of the host. If we don't do what he says, we will be punished in some way. In light of the new information and all of the information we have, that could mean a whole host of things we won't interpret. Leadership holds hosts to account rather than operating out of fear of stirring the beast. So I have this to ask you. In light of what the CBC has said repeatedly, in light of what Hubert Lacroix said on Friday in his memo, doesn't this sort of say to you, they know a little bit more than what they're saying?
It is getting increasingly hard for CBC execs to deny that there was evidence. I was going to say plenty of evidence, but let me give them an extraordinary benefit of the doubt and just say evidence that things that were going on with Ghomeshi, with his show, and with his staff were not hunky-dory, were not the way they should be, were not the kind of employment contract, employment environment that anybody would deem appropriate. So, as the CBC says, the first time we found out about this was, say, a couple of days before the termination, and only when we were showed that evidence did we decide that he was now incompatible with being a CBC host. This doesn't speak specifically to sexual harassment now or to the sexual assaults that are alleged, but it does speak to this culture where the host is, they call him the beast, and if you stir the beast, there's going to be hell to pay, and everybody's effectively walking on eggshells in the studio.
And no one's talking about Big Ears Teddy when it comes to that beast. All right, Howard, you are one of Canada's most preeminent employment and labor lawyers. If you had clients that came to you with this draft memo and said, my company did nothing in a unionized environment, what would you do?
Well, interesting, because it's a unionized environment, you don't have the same protections that you would if you were not in a union. If you were not in a union, any woman who suffered any kind of degradation as a result of that, or if they lost their job, or if they left it as a result of that environment voluntarily because of what would be considered a constructive dismissal, could not only have a constructive dismissal claim, but could sue for negligence. And the damages for negligence can be in the millions of dollars. If the person has been so psychiatrically damaged and can't work for several years, unlike a wrongful dismissal case where you're limited to effectively 24 months pay at the high end, it could be pay until you would have otherwise retired.
And then, of course, we as the taxpayers would be on the hook for that because we fund the CBC, and so it's going to be us paying for it.
And this investigation, I have real concerns about this investigation.
With the one that Janice Rubin is going to be conducting, the so-called independent third-party investigation.
And we were talking off air about how independent it was, but in any event, the CBC is running the investigation, even on the surface. Shouldn't the government of Canada be investigating the CBC?
I'm glad you asked that, because I had the Status of Women Minister here with me, exactly where you guys are sitting, Kelly Leach, and I asked her that question. That are you comfortable with a Crown corporation investigating itself? I mean, this isn't just some company. This is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. This is $1 billion of taxpayers' money. I think the government right now, they have a few talking points. They're not going to dip their toe into this. They don't want to look into this. They're not, going to dive in when everybody thinks that the Conservatives be chomping at the bit to get rid of the CBC. So they'll keep their even keel. But this is extraordinary. This memo alone, and they had to go to the point of code naming it Red Sky to keep it secret, and then they had these covert secret meetings set up. I mean, it's quite an operation they had. But what it says to me is, that is a heck of a work environment to have exist under that and that amount of stress.
Now, I mean, the interesting thing to me, again, dividing between criminal law and employment law, right? As an employment lawyer reading this, I suspect Howard sort of rubs his hands a little bit gleefully and says, "There's lots of problems here for the CBC coming up." As a criminal lawyer, thinking where Marie Hennon,
I'm a taxpayer too.
Fair enough. That's right. Your bill comes out of our bill at the end of the day, no matter what. But looking at it from Marie Hennon's perspective, the lawyer who's now been hired for Ghomeshi on the sexual assault side, here's a potential for me as a lawyer to say, you know what, this is really about people hating my management style. I may have been a jerk at in production. I was a jerk to all the people who worked for me. I didn't treat anybody fairly. That's the reason why they're all now coming forward well after the fact and fabricating, this would be the defense, fabricating sexual assault allegations that really were just consensual behavior, perhaps at the margins of what the average John and Jane do, but still well within the consent barrier. So this is starting to plant the seeds to me of what may be a potential defense. What hurts him on the employment side might actually help him on the criminal side.
Even on the employment side, there's nothing illegal about being a tough boss, as long as you make your standards clear. And there's also nothing wrong with saying you're not to go out and damage the brand. In fact, that's cause for discharge.
Someone jokingly said, I won't name it, who read this and thought, well, this could be a memo that comes out of any work environment. It just so happens that because of the ongoing salacious details we're getting coming out of CBC and
we're reinterpreting it.
Sure, absolutely.
Possibly.
And that's the challenge. So a little bit of time we have left. When all is said and done, we've got this third-party investigation. We had heard at one point that the Transportation Committee at the federal level was going to ask some questions to the CBC union of the infamous, Watergate question, who knew what when. But I don't know if that's good enough. I don't think the public will find that to be good enough. Howard,
and the union is not going to want to say
no.
we were dilatory, we didn't do our job, we didn't push forward.
Not. Of course They're not going to be candid
just like
about
the CBC.
That. Well, sure. And Jesse Brown from Canada Land says he's got documentation specifically saying that the union had told this one woman who had complained that Ghomeshi had said some pretty distasteful things to her, shall we say. She complained to the union. The union acknowledged it and said, we're moving this up the chain, and nothing happened. She eventually left the corporation. How damaging is that? What would a case like hers, if she came to you, to your office, Howard, and said, look, this is what happened, I want to sue, I want to do something. What does she get?
I could tell you this. Her case may not be as good as the next woman who was treated the same way. Because now they've been warned, they didn't do anything, and it happened again. And now they're negligent.
Yes.
Maybe this is the first time they heard about it from this woman, so that isn't negligence. And maybe she left before they could have taken remedial opportunities. I don't know.
Sure.
But once they're put on notice, every woman after that has a case.
Ed, last word to you.
Well, just following up on Howard's, we know that this was the case with one person. This is the allegation. It's all around Jian Ghomeshi.
Yeah.
The CBC needs to enable Ruben, or anybody else for that matter, to take a broad look at how it works in its studios across the board. Because as Howard says, they're on notice now. If there's another Ghomeshi allegation, and it doesn't have to be him, it can be any other host, if that's the way work is like at the CBC, the second, the third, the fourth complaints are going to be far more painful than the first.
Okay.